The mist clung to the forest floor like the ghosts of secrets buried deep beneath Michigan's soil. For nearly a century, the towering pines and sprawling oaks had stood sentinel over a mystery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about Prohibition-era bootlegging operations. When conservation workers stumbled upon the first wooden planks protruding from the earth during routine trail maintenance in October 2024, they had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most sophisticated underground networks ever discovered in the American Midwest. The broken door, weathered by decades of rain and snow, hung askew like a mouth frozen mid-scream, revealing glimpses of metal gleaming in the darkness beyond. What lay beneath would rewrite the story of Thomas "Red Tom" McKinnon, the legendary bootlegger who vanished without a trace on a bitter February night exactly 100 years ago. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community and captured the imagination of true crime enthusiasts across the nation. Here, hidden beneath layers of decomposing leaves and tangled root systems, was evidence of an operation far more elaborate than anyone had imagined possible. The tunnel system, though more modest than legends had suggested, still stretched for several hundred yards underground, connecting multiple hidden chambers that once housed significant quantities of illegal alcohol during the height of Prohibition. But, more than just a bootlegging operation, this underground network told the story of a man who had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving behind only whispers and legends that grew more elaborate with each passing decade. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath as investigators began their careful excavation. Every broken board, every rusted piece of metal, every fragment of glass bottle told a piece of the story. The door that had first caught the workers' attention was just the beginning. Beneath it lay a steel portal that had somehow survived the elements, its surface pocked with rust but still intact after all these years. When researchers finally pried it open, the beam of their flashlights revealed a descending staircase carved directly into the bedrock, each step worn smooth by countless footsteps from an era when America had declared war on alcohol, and men like Red Tom McKinnon had fought back with ingenuity, determination, and an underground operation that challenged federal authority in ways that defied imagination. The stale air that escaped from the depths carried with it the faintest phantom sense of grain alcohol and wood smoke, as if the tunnels themselves retained memories of the bustling activity that once filled their chambers. Investigators would later discover that the network included not only storage areas and a distillation room, but also living quarters, meeting spaces, and what appeared to be a primitive communications area with remnants of telephone equipment. The sophistication of the operation, while not as vast as folklore had suggested, still demonstrated that Red Tom had been far more than just another small-time bootlegger trying to make a quick profit during Prohibition. He had been running what amounted to a well-organized criminal enterprise, a hidden operation that challenged every assumption about rural Michigan's role in the illegal alcohol trade. As news of the discovery spread, descendants of families who had lived in the area during the 1920s began coming forward with stories passed down through generations. Tales of mysterious lights moving through the forest at night, of strange sounds emanating from beneath the ground, of men who disappeared into the woods carrying heavy loads and emerged hours later empty-handed. These stories, dismissed for decades as local folklore, suddenly took on new significance in light of what lay buried beneath the forest floor. The discovery would not only solve one of Michigan's oldest missing person cases, but also reveal the true scope of one man's audacious challenge to federal authority during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. Thomas McKinnon had arrived in northern Michigan in the early spring of 1917, more than 2 years before the Volstead Act would transform the American social landscape forever. At 30 years old, he possessed the kind of restless energy that seemed to crackle in the air around him wherever he went. Standing just over 6 feet tall with a shock of auburn hair that earned him his nickname, Red Tom commanded attention without demanding it. His Irish heritage showed in the sharp angles of his face and the green eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Those who knew him described a man of contradictions, charming yet secretive, generous yet calculating, loyal to his friends but ruthless to his enemies. Before Prohibition transformed him into a legend, McKinnon had worked as a mining engineer in Colorado, where he had gained valuable experience with underground excavation and the logistics of moving materials through confined spaces. This expertise would prove crucial when he decided to enter the bootlegging business. But in 1917, he was simply another young man looking for a fresh start in a region rich with opportunity. He purchased a modest farm on the outskirts of Traverse City using money he claimed to have saved from his mining work, though some suspected his funds came from less legitimate sources. The property included over 100 acres of dense forest, much of it considered marginal by local standards due to its rocky soil and difficult terrain. What others saw as a liability, McKinnon recognized as the perfect cover for his future plans. The transformation began slowly and methodically over the course of 2.5 years. McKinnon hired local men to help with what he described as improvements to his property, paying fair wages for work that seemed oddly secretive. Workers were hired for specific tasks and rarely saw the full scope of the operation. Some dug what they were told were root cellars or drainage systems. Others hauled in equipment and supplies without knowing their ultimate purpose. Still others worked on what appeared to be conventional farming activities above ground, providing the perfect cover for the construction project taking place below. McKinnon's personality made him ideally suited for such an undertaking. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, knowing instinctively whom he could trust and whom he should avoid. Local residents found him likable enough, though they sensed there was more to their new neighbor than met the eye. He attended church regularly when in town, contributed to community causes, and maintained friendly relationships with his neighbors without ever revealing too much about his background or his plans. This carefully cultivated public persona would prove invaluable as his operation developed. During the summer and fall of 1919, as national debate about prohibition intensified, McKinnon accelerated his preparations. He understood that the coming ban on alcohol would create enormous opportunities for those willing to take the risks involved in illegal production and distribution. While other potential bootleggers were still debating whether the law would actually be enforced, he was already creating the infrastructure necessary to capitalize on what he correctly predicted would be massive demand for illegal alcohol. The construction of his underground facility required careful planning and considerable skill. Working primarily at night and during periods when curious neighbors were unlikely to observe his activities, McKinnon and a small crew of trusted workers gradually excavated a network of chambers connected by tunnels, carved directly into the rock substrate beneath his property. The work was backbreaking and dangerous, requiring the removal of tons of rock and soil that had to be disposed of without attracting attention. The main tunnel extended approximately 200 yards from his farmhouse basement into the forest, with several smaller branches leading to various functional areas. The engineering was sound if not spectacular, utilizing McKinnon's mining background to ensure structural stability while maintaining secrecy. Ventilation was provided through carefully concealed shafts that appeared to be natural features when viewed from above ground. A small electrical system, connected to the main house through buried cables, provided lighting for the underground areas. By the time Prohibition officially began in January 1920, McKinnon was ready. While other would-be bootleggers scrambled to establish supply lines and find secure storage locations, he had already spent months perfecting an operation that, while more modest than later legends would suggest, was still remarkably sophisticated for its time and place. His underground network included a main distillation area with a single high-quality copper still, storage rooms that could accommodate several hundred gallons of finished product, and basic living quarters that could house 4 to 6 men when necessary. What set McKinnon apart from other bootleggers was not just the planning that went into his operation, but the quality of his product. While many illegal distillers cut corners to maximize profits, often producing alcohol that was dangerous to consume, McKinnon insisted on reasonable standards. He obtained quality grain through legitimate agricultural contacts, hired an experienced distiller who had worked in legal operations before Prohibition, and invested in equipment that produced alcohol that was safe and relatively smooth. His reputation for quality spread through word of mouth among the growing network of speakeasies and private clubs that had sprung up across the region. The success of his operation allowed McKinnon to expand his business relationships beyond simple local distribution. He became connected to a network that stretched from suppliers in Canada to distributors in Detroit and Chicago, coordinating shipments and managing relationships with other criminal organizations. His underground complex served as a crucial link in this chain, providing secure storage and processing facilities for alcohol destined for markets throughout the Midwest. The profits were substantial, allowing him to continue improving his operation and increasing his influence within the regional criminal underworld. But success also brought danger. By 1923, federal agents were well aware that someone in northern Michigan was running a significant bootlegging operation, even if they had not yet identified McKinnon as their target. His careful security measures and the loyalty of his associates had protected him thus far, but the pressure was mounting. Rival criminal organizations were also taking notice, seeing his success as both an opportunity and a threat. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would ultimately lead to his disappearance and the abandonment of the underground operation he had worked so hard to create. Those who knew Red Tom McKinnon during his final months described a man who seemed increasingly aware that his time was running out. He had always been careful about security, but his precautions became almost obsessive as 1924 began. He varied his routines, trusted fewer people with sensitive information, and began making arrangements that suggested he was preparing for an extended absence or worse. Some who worked for him reported that he had mentioned having contingency plans in place, though he never revealed the details of these preparations. The man who had once seemed confident and in control was beginning to show signs of the enormous stress that came with running a criminal enterprise while staying one step ahead of both law enforcement and rival criminals. The isolation of his lifestyle had begun to weigh heavily on him as well. Living constantly under an assumed identity, maintaining elaborate deceptions about his activities, and trusting no one completely had taken a psychological toll that was becoming increasingly evident to those who knew him well. He had no close personal relationships outside his criminal associates, no family, connections that could provide emotional support, and no legitimate social activities that might have offered relief from the constant tension of his illegal activities. McKinnon had also begun to suspect that someone within his own organization might be providing information to his enemies. Small inconsistencies in reports from his associates, minor security breaches that could not be easily explained, and subtle changes in the behavior of men he had previously trusted completely had convinced him that betrayal was imminent. His paranoia, while perhaps justified by the circumstances, was making it increasingly difficult for him to function effectively as a leader and decision-maker. February 15, 1924, dawned crisp and clear across northern Michigan, with temperatures hovering just below freezing and a light dusting of snow covering the ground. For Thomas McKinnon, it began like any other day in what had become a carefully orchestrated routine designed to maintain the facade of legitimate farming while overseeing his bootlegging operation. He rose before dawn, as was his habit, and spent the early morning hours reviewing reports from his small group of trusted associates about production levels, security concerns, and distribution schedules. The underground complex operated on a more limited scale than legends would later suggest, but it still required constant attention to maintain both productivity and secrecy. The first indication that this day would be different came during his regular morning inspection of the property perimeter. McKinnon made this tour daily, ostensibly checking on his legitimate farming operations, but actually observing the carefully concealed signs that indicated the status of his underground activities. On this particular morning, he noticed that one of his lookouts had left a subtle signal indicating possible surveillance in the area. The signal itself was not immediately alarming. Federal agents and local law enforcement had increased their presence in the region over recent months, but something about the timing and location troubled him deeply. His instincts, honed by years of living on the edge of discovery, told him that today was different from the routine law enforcement patrols that had become common in the area. There was something more purposeful about the activity he was observing, something that suggested his enemies might finally be closing in on his operation. The careful balance between caution and operational necessity that had kept him safe for so many years was beginning to shift in ways that made him increasingly uncomfortable. By mid-morning, McKinnon had gathered his small inner circle for an emergency meeting in the main chamber deep beneath the forest floor. The room, carved from solid rock and furnished with simple but functional furniture that had been lowered through hidden entrances, served as the nerve center for his entire operation. The four men who assembled there represented the most trusted and capable individuals in his organization, each responsible for a different aspect of the logistics that kept illegal alcohol flowing from his distillery to customers across the region. The discussion that morning centered on intelligence reports suggesting that federal agents were planning a major operation in the area. McKinnon's sources within local law enforcement had provided warnings about increased activity, but the information was fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Some of his associates urged immediate action to secure the most valuable inventory and prepare for a possible raid. Others argued that the threat might be directed at competing operations and that hasty moves could actually attract unwanted attention. The debate was intense but conducted in whispers, as they all understood that sound could carry through the rock walls to other parts of the complex. McKinnon listened carefully to all perspectives before making his decision, weighing the risks of action against the dangers of inaction. His years of experience had taught him that premature reactions to threats could be just as dangerous as failing to respond to real dangers. The complexity of maintaining his operation while avoiding detection required constant judgment calls that balanced numerous competing factors, and he had survived this long by making more correct decisions than wrong ones. Rather than ordering an immediate evacuation or shutdown, McKinnon chose a middle course that reflected both his confidence in his security measures and his understanding of the risks involved. He ordered increased vigilance from his lookouts, accelerated the shipment of finished inventory to secure locations, and activated several contingency plans that had been developed for exactly this type of situation. Most importantly, he decided to personally oversee a shipment that was scheduled to leave that evening, believing that his direct involvement would ensure everything went smoothly during this potentially dangerous period. The afternoon was spent in detailed preparation for the evening's operation. The shipment consisted of approximately 50 gallons of premium whiskey, destined for speakeasies in Detroit, representing one of the larger single consignments McKinnon had attempted to move in recent months. The logistics were complex, involving multiple vehicles, several different routes, and careful coordination with distributors who would handle the final delivery. McKinnon personally inspected every aspect of the preparation, from the quality of the product to the reliability of the vehicles that would transport it. As evening approached, the normal activity in the underground complex intensified within its necessarily limited scope. Workers moved with practiced efficiency through the tunnels, loading cases of bottles onto carts that would transport them to hidden exits scattered throughout his property. The main distillation operation was shut down temporarily, its fire banked but ready to resume production once the shipment was safely away. Security personnel took up positions along all the major access routes, ready to provide warning if law enforcement or rival criminals attempted to interfere with the operation. McKinnon himself made final preparations in his private quarters deep within the complex. The small room, carved from rock like the rest of the facility, contained his personal possessions and the documents necessary to coordinate his various business activities. He dressed in dark clothing suitable for moving through the forest at night, checked the weapons he always carried during dangerous operations, and reviewed once more the detailed plans that would guide the evening's activities. Those who saw him during these final hours noted that he seemed calm but unusually tense, displaying none of his typical confidence. The shipment began moving shortly after sunset, with the first vehicle departing through a concealed exit while McKinnon remained below ground, coordinating the overall operation. Everything proceeded according to plan for the first several hours, with regular check-ins from his drivers, confirming that they were making good progress along their predetermined routes. The underground complex gradually returned to its normal nighttime routine, as the bulk of the inventory was successfully moved to secure staging areas. It was approaching midnight when McKinnon finally emerged from the tunnels to personally handle what he had described to his associates as a final delivery that required his direct attention. This involved a smaller, high-value consignment that he had decided to manage personally, partly for security reasons and partly because the buyers were important contacts whose relationships he preferred to handle directly. He met with two of his most trusted associates at one of the hidden exits, reviewed the final details of their route, and then set off into the dark forest carrying a leather satchel that witnesses would later describe as small but apparently heavy. The three men followed a path that wound through the densest part of the forest, avoiding the main roads where they might encounter law enforcement patrols. The route had been used many times before without incident, and McKinnon was familiar with every twist and turn along the way. The temperature had dropped several degrees since sunset, and their breath formed visible clouds in the cold air as they made their way through the snow-covered underbrush. None of them spoke during the journey, understanding that sound carried far in the still night air and that their safety depended on remaining undetected. They had traveled approximately a mile and a half from the hidden exit when McKinnon suddenly stopped and raised his hand, signaling his companions to halt immediately. For several long moments, all three men stood perfectly still, listening intently to the sounds of the forest around them. Later, his associates would report that they had heard nothing unusual, but McKinnon seemed convinced that something was wrong. The forest, which should have been filled with the normal sounds of nocturnal animals, seemed unnaturally quiet, as if other presences had disturbed the natural rhythm of the night. McKinnon's years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, even when logic suggested that his fears might be unfounded. He had survived numerous close calls by paying attention to subtle signs that others might have ignored, and something about this particular night felt different from their previous journeys through the forest. The unusual law enforcement activity during the day, combined with his growing suspicions about betrayal within his organization, had put him on high alert for any sign of danger. He whispered brief instructions to his companions, telling them to continue to the rendezvous point while he investigated what had caught his attention. His associates later recalled that he seemed unusually agitated, more concerned about the potential threat than they had ever seen him during their previous operations together. The decision to separate from his companions represented a departure from his normal security protocols, which always emphasized staying together during potentially dangerous situations. This was the last time anyone would see Thomas McKinnon alive. His two associates waited at the predetermined meeting point for over an hour before deciding that something had gone seriously wrong. They returned to the spot where they had last seen him, but found no trace of their leader or any indication of what might have happened to him. The satchel he had been carrying was gone, and there were no signs of a struggle or any other disturbance that might explain his sudden disappearance into the winter night. The forest seemed to have swallowed him completely, leaving behind only questions and a mystery that would endure for exactly 100 years. The careful plans he had made, the sophisticated operation he had built, and the contingencies he had prepared all proved useless in the face of whatever had befallen him during those final moments in the dark woods. His associates searched frantically through the night, calling his name in hoarse whispers and examining every shadow that might have concealed his body, but the forest revealed nothing. The search that began immediately and continued for days would uncover no clues to McKinnon's fate. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only an underground operation that would soon crumble without his leadership and guidance. The mystery of what happened during those final moments in the dark forest would endure for exactly 100 years, until the discovery of his hidden tunnels provided new insights into the extraordinary life and mysterious disappearance of Red Tom McKinnon. When Thomas McKinnon failed to return from his midnight rendezvous, his carefully constructed criminal operation began its first tentative steps toward dissolution. The two associates who had witnessed his disappearance returned to the underground complex in the early morning hours of February 16th, their report sending shockwaves through an organization that had never contemplated functioning without its determined leader. Within hours, word of McKinnon's vanishing had spread through every level of the operation, from the men who tended the distillation equipment deep in the tunnels to the lookouts posted throughout the surrounding forest. The immediate response revealed both the organization of McKinnon's operation and its ultimate dependence on his personal leadership and decision-making abilities. His lieutenant, a former mining colleague named Patrick O'Sullivan, who had joined McKinnon in Michigan during the early days of Prohibition, took charge of the emergency protocols that had been established for exactly this type of crisis. The underground complex was placed on high alert, with all non-essential personnel evacuated and the most valuable equipment and inventory moved to secure backup locations that McKinnon had prepared for emergencies. The main distillation operations were shut down completely, with fires extinguished and equipment carefully concealed to eliminate any evidence of recent activity. The systematic approach to the emergency procedures demonstrated the level of planning that McKinnon had invested in preparing for various contingencies, though no one had anticipated that their leader himself would be the casualty that triggered these protocols. The efficiency with which his associates executed these procedures also revealed the quality of the personnel he had recruited and trained for his operation. Local law enforcement agencies were surprisingly slow to learn of McKinnon's disappearance, partly because his organization was necessarily secretive, and partly because those who might have reported him missing had their own compelling reasons for avoiding contact with authorities. The bootlegger had been careful to maintain his cover as a quiet farmer, and his criminal associates understood that involving law enforcement in the search for their missing leader could expose them all to prosecution. It was not until February 20th, nearly 5 days after he had vanished, that Sheriff Robert Coleman received the first official report about a missing person matching McKinnon's description. Even then, the report came not from his criminal associates, but from concerned neighbors who had noticed that no one had been seen around the McKinnon farm for several days. The farmer who lived closest to McKinnon's property had become worried when he observed no smoke from the chimney and no signs of normal daily activity around the buildings. His concern was genuine, but based entirely on McKinnon's carefully constructed public persona as a legitimate farmer who maintained regular schedules and normal social interactions with his neighbors. Sheriff Coleman's initial investigation was hampered by the same factors that had protected McKinnon's operation throughout its existence. The bootlegger had cultivated an image as a quiet, law-abiding farmer, and there was nothing in his public persona that would suggest criminal activity or the kind of enemies who might wish him harm. His property appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be: a modest farming operation in a remote location that showed no signs of unusual activity or recent disturbances. The sheriff and his deputies found no obvious signs of foul play, no indication of where McKinnon might have gone, and no witnesses who could provide useful information about his whereabouts or activities. His farmhouse was neat and orderly, with no signs of hasty departure or violent struggle. Personal possessions remained in their normal places, and there was no evidence that McKinnon had packed for travel or prepared to leave permanently. The scene suggested that he had simply stepped away from his normal routine and failed to return, leaving no clues about his intentions or destination. The federal response was more intensive but equally fruitless in its initial stages. Prohibition agents had been tracking bootlegging activity in the region for months, and McKinnon's name had appeared in several intelligence reports as a person of interest whose activities warranted closer examination. When news of his disappearance reached federal authorities, they launched their own investigation, suspecting that his vanishing might be connected to criminal activity that fell within their jurisdiction. Teams of federal agents combed the forest around his property, interviewed local residents about their knowledge of McKinnon and his activities, and examined his financial records for clues about his business relationships and potential criminal associations. The investigation was thorough and professional, utilizing the best techniques available to law enforcement in 1924, but it failed to uncover the carefully concealed evidence of McKinnon's true activities. What the investigators found was a masterpiece of misdirection and careful planning that had been years in the making. McKinnon's legitimate farming activities provided a plausible explanation for his modest wealth, and his financial records showed no obvious connections to criminal enterprises or suspicious transactions. His farm showed evidence of normal agricultural activity appropriate for the season, and the buildings contained nothing more suspicious than typical farming equipment and supplies that any legitimate farmer might have owned. Even his personal possessions revealed little about the man himself beyond what his public persona suggested. Investigators found books on farming and agricultural techniques, correspondence with legitimate suppliers and equipment manufacturers, and personal items that painted the picture of a quiet bachelor living a simple, rural life. There were no weapons beyond what might be expected for legitimate hunting and pest control, no communications with known criminals, and no evidence of the wealth that successful bootlegging might have generated. The underground complex that represented his true achievement remained completely hidden from the investigators despite their thorough search of his property. The concealed entrances had been designed to withstand exactly this type of scrutiny, blending seamlessly with the natural landscape and showing no signs of recent construction or regular use. The sophisticated ventilation systems that had allowed his distillation operations to function undetected now served to hide even the slightest trace of the activities that had taken place below ground. The few men who knew the locations of the hidden entrances had either fled the area immediately after McKinnon's disappearance or maintained absolute silence about their existence when questioned by investigators. Their loyalty to their missing leader, combined with their understanding that revealing the operation would expose them to serious criminal charges, ensured that the secret remained safe even under official scrutiny. To the frustrated investigators, it appeared that Thomas McKinnon had simply vanished, without leaving behind any evidence of criminal activity or association with illegal enterprises. As days turned into weeks without progress in the investigation, different theories began to emerge about what might have happened to the missing man. Some investigators suspected that he had been murdered by rival criminals, possibly during a business dispute or territorial conflict that had escalated beyond negotiation. Others believed he might have staged his own disappearance, perhaps after receiving warning of impending law enforcement action that would have resulted in his arrest and prosecution. A few investigators even suggested that he might have been killed by his own associates, either in an internal power struggle or to prevent him from cooperating with authorities if he had been captured. This theory gained some credibility when investigators learned that several men who had worked for McKinnon had left the area shortly after his disappearance, though there was no evidence that their departures were connected to any criminal activity. The most persistent theory, and the one that would eventually prove closest to the truth, suggested that McKinnon had been the victim of a carefully planned ambush by individuals who knew his routines and habits. According to this scenario, rival criminals or corrupt law enforcement officials had learned about his midnight activities and arranged to intercept him during his journey through the forest. The complete absence of physical evidence was explained by the perpetrators' careful planning and their intimate knowledge of the local terrain, which would have allowed them to dispose of both McKinnon and any evidence of their crime without leaving traces that investigators could follow. As the investigation continued through the spring and summer of 1924, McKinnon's criminal organization gradually dispersed and dissolved. Without his leadership and organizational skills, the various components of his operation could not maintain their coordination and effectiveness. Some of his former associates attempted to continue operating on a much smaller scale, but they lacked both the resources and the expertise necessary to maintain the systems McKinnon had developed over several years of careful planning and gradual expansion. Others fled the area entirely, fearing that their connection to the missing bootlegger might eventually expose them to law enforcement scrutiny as the investigation continued. The network of contacts and business relationships that McKinnon had built up over years of careful cultivation began to dissolve as his associates scattered, and his enemies moved to fill the vacuum left by his disappearance. The underground complex itself was carefully sealed and abandoned by the few men who knew of its existence and location. The main entrances were concealed with particular care, using techniques that McKinnon himself had developed to hide the facility from casual observation. Valuable equipment was either removed by his former associates or hidden so effectively that it would remain undiscovered for decades. The tunnels that had once housed a functioning criminal enterprise fell silent, slowly beginning the long process of decay that would eventually obscure most traces of the remarkable operation they had contained. By the end of 1924, the official investigation into Thomas McKinnon's disappearance had been suspended due to lack of evidence and viable leads to pursue. Sheriff Coleman filed a final report, concluding that McKinnon had most likely been the victim of foul play, but acknowledging that insufficient evidence existed to identify suspects or pursue criminal charges. Federal agents reached similar conclusions, though they maintained their suspicions about McKinnon's possible involvement in bootlegging activities, even without proof. The case was never formally closed, but active investigations ceased, and McKinnon joined the ranks of missing persons whose fates would remain forever unknown to official authorities. His name would appear occasionally in law enforcement reports over the following years, usually in connection with other bootlegging investigations, but no new evidence would emerge to shed light on his ultimate fate or the circumstances of his disappearance. The mystery of Red Tom McKinnon's disappearance would endure for exactly 100 years, becoming part of local folklore and inspiring countless theories about what really happened during those final moments in the dark forest. Some claimed to have seen his ghost wandering the woods on winter nights, still carrying his mysterious satchel and searching for the rendezvous that never came. Others insisted that he had successfully escaped to Canada or Mexico, where he lived out his days under an assumed identity far from the scene of his criminal activities. But until the discovery of his underground operation in 2024, no physical evidence existed to support any of these theories, or to provide definitive answers about the fate of northern Michigan's most successful and enigmatic bootlegger. The forest had kept his secrets secure for a full century, waiting for the chance discovery that would finally reveal the truth about his extraordinary life and mysterious death. The decades that followed Thomas McKinnon's disappearance transformed northern Michigan from a remote frontier region into a popular tourist destination. But the mystery of the vanished bootlegger remained as compelling as ever to each new generation that discovered the story. Local historians collected fragmentary accounts from aging residents who claimed to remember McKinnon or his activities, though the accuracy of these memories became increasingly questionable as the years passed and the stories grew more elaborate in the telling. During the 1930s, as the Great Depression gripped the region and Prohibition finally ended with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, some of McKinnon's former associates began to speak more openly about their experiences during the bootlegging era. The end of the illegal alcohol trade removed the immediate danger of prosecution for their past activities, and economic hardship made the stories of McKinnon's prosperity particularly appealing to struggling families who remembered the 20s as a time of greater opportunity. These accounts, shared in taverns and around kitchen tables throughout the region, revealed tantalizing glimpses of the operation that had once thrived beneath the forest floor. Former workers described the underground chambers in terms that seemed almost too fantastic to believe, speaking of tunnels carved from solid rock, distillation equipment that rivaled anything found in legitimate breweries, and storage areas that had held thousands of dollars worth of illegal alcohol during the height of Prohibition. One of the most detailed and credible accounts came from Patrick O'Sullivan, McKinnon's former lieutenant, who had fled to Canada immediately after his leader's disappearance, but returned to Michigan in 1936 when economic necessity outweighed his concerns about potential legal consequences. In interviews with local newspaper reporters hungry for colorful stories during the Depression years, O'Sullivan described the underground complex in terms that were detailed and consistent, though he portrayed the operation as somewhat larger and more sophisticated than it had actually been. O'Sullivan's descriptions captured the public imagination and convinced many listeners of their basic accuracy, but he steadfastly refused to reveal the locations of the hidden entrances or provide specific details that might have led to their discovery. He claimed that McKinnon had sworn all his associates to secrecy about the facility's location and that this oath remained binding even after their leader's death. When pressed by reporters and treasure hunters for more specific information, O'Sullivan would only say that the entrances were scattered throughout the forest and concealed so cleverly that they might never be found without detailed maps that had died with McKinnon. Other former associates provided corroborating accounts that filled in additional details about the operation, while carefully avoiding any information that might have compromised the security of the hidden complex. They described the security measures McKinnon had implemented, including a network of lookouts who could communicate warnings throughout the organization using signals that appeared to casual observers as natural features of the forest landscape. They spoke of the quality of the alcohol produced in the underground distillery, explaining the processes McKinnon had used to ensure that his products were safe to consume and superior to much of the dangerous liquor that other bootleggers sold to unsuspecting customers. These stories attracted the attention of treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists who spent considerable time and effort searching the forest for evidence of McKinnon's legendary operation. Armed with metal detectors, shovels, and copies of old maps, they combed through thousands of acres looking for hidden entrances, buried equipment, or any other physical traces of the underground complex. A few claimed to have found suspicious depressions in the ground or unusual rock formations that might mark tunnel entrances, but none of these discoveries led to actual access to the hidden chambers. Professional archaeologists showed little interest in these amateur efforts, partly because they doubted the accuracy of the increasingly elaborate stories about McKinnon's operation, and partly because they had more pressing and scientifically valuable projects to pursue. The few academic researchers who investigated the legend concluded that while McKinnon had probably been involved in some level of bootlegging activity, the descriptions of his underground empire were likely exaggerated far beyond any historical reality. They pointed out that the engineering challenges involved in such construction would have been enormous, especially for a criminal operation that had to maintain absolute secrecy while working with limited resources and largely untrained labor. The logistics of excavating and disposing of tons of rock and soil, installing ventilation and electrical systems, and coordinating the activities of dozens of workers without attracting attention seemed impossible given the technology and resources available in rural Michigan during the 1920s. World War II brought new changes to the region and temporarily diverted attention from the McKinnon mystery as the nation focused on more immediate concerns. The war effort created demand for lumber from the northern Michigan forests, leading to extensive logging operations that altered the landscape significantly and destroyed many of the landmarks that treasure hunters had used to guide their searches. Some hopeful individuals believed that this massive earth-moving activity might reveal hidden entrances to McKinnon's tunnels, but the intensive harvesting produced nothing more than deeper frustration for those who continued to believe in the legend. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s and 60s brought increasing numbers of tourists to northern Michigan, drawn by the region's natural beauty and recreational opportunities that had been largely inaccessible during the Depression and war years. Tourist guides began including the McKinnon story in their presentations, usually emphasizing its mysterious and romantic aspects, while downplaying the criminal elements that might discourage family visitors from exploring the area. Gift shops sold books and pamphlets about the legendary Bootlegger, and several restaurants and lodges adopted names and themes that referenced his supposed activities. The story became part of the region's marketing identity, attracting visitors who hoped to experience some connection to the colorful history of the Prohibition era. Local festivals and events began incorporating McKinnon themes, further cementing his place in regional folklore. During the 1970s, renewed interest in local history and genealogy led to more systematic efforts to document the McKinnon story and separate established facts from creative fiction. Researchers at the local historical society interviewed elderly residents who claimed personal knowledge of McKinnon or his associates, recorded their accounts on audio tape, and attempted to verify details through official records and contemporary documents that had survived in various archives. These efforts produced a clearer and more accurate picture of McKinnon as a person, confirming that he had indeed been involved in bootlegging activities and had operated from his farm north of Traverse City. However, the research also revealed how extensively the legend had grown beyond the historical facts, with later accounts attributing to McKinnon achievements and adventures that clearly belonged to other bootleggers or were entirely fictional. The development of more sophisticated archaeological techniques during the 1980s and 90s raised new hopes among those who continued to believe in the underground complex. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies offered the possibility of detecting buried structures without the need for expensive and potentially destructive excavation. Several surveys were conducted in areas where local traditions suggested McKinnon's tunnels might be located, but none of these high-tech searches produced definitive evidence of underground construction or confirmed the existence of the legendary complex. As the 20th century drew to a close, the McKinnon mystery had become thoroughly embedded in local culture and tourist promotion, while remaining frustratingly resistant to resolution through conventional investigation methods. The story appeared in numerous books about Michigan history and unsolved mysteries, was featured in television documentaries about Prohibition-era criminals, and inspired fiction writers who used the legend as the basis for novels and screenplays that further blurred the line between historical fact and creative imagination. Each retelling added new elements to the story, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish between historical fact and creative embellishment. The McKinnon of popular culture bore only a passing resemblance to the actual man who had lived and died in northern Michigan, but the mythical version had taken on a life of its own that seemed independent of any connection to historical reality. The centennial anniversary of McKinnon's disappearance in 2024 generated renewed media attention and prompted fresh efforts to solve the mystery using modern investigative techniques. Local newspapers ran retrospective articles about the case, television stations produced special programs about unsolved crimes from the Prohibition era, and internet discussion forums buzzed with theories about what might have happened to the legendary bootlegger during his final night in the forest. Some investigators attempted to use new technologies to analyze old photographs and documents, searching for clues that previous generations might have overlooked or lacked the tools to interpret properly. Others focused on genealogical research, hoping to trace the descendants of McKinnon's known associates who might possess family documents or oral traditions that could provide new insights into the mystery. It was in this atmosphere of renewed interest and investigation that the conservation workers made their momentous discovery in October 2024. The broken wooden door protruding from the forest floor was initially dismissed by the workers themselves as debris from an old hunting cabin or storage shed, but careful examination revealed construction techniques and materials that were consistent with 1920s craftsmanship and clearly much older than typical hunting shelters. More importantly, the door's location corresponded closely with areas that had been identified in historical accounts as possible sites for McKinnon's hidden entrances. The discovery site was approximately 3 miles from McKinnon's farm, and deep within the forest area where his associates had reported losing contact with him on the night of his disappearance. The proximity to these historically significant locations, combined with the apparent age and construction quality of the door, suggested that this discovery might finally provide the physical evidence that had eluded investigators for exactly 1 century. The discovery would prove to be the key that finally unlocked a mystery that had captured imaginations for generations, providing concrete evidence for stories that had long been dismissed as folklore, and revealing that the truth about Red Tom McKinnon, while perhaps not as elaborate as the most fantastic legends suggested, was still far more extraordinary than most skeptics had been willing to believe. The underground complex that awaited discovery beneath the forest floor would validate many of the accounts provided by men like Patrick O'Sullivan and demonstrate that McKinnon had indeed created something remarkable during his brief but intense career as Northern Michigan's most successful bootlegger. The initial discovery of the wooden door protruding from the forest floor on October 23, 2024, came about through the kind of fortunate accident that archaeologists dream about but rarely experience in their professional careers. 2 conservation workers, Sarah Chen and Michael Rodriguez, had been assigned to clear fallen trees from a popular hiking trail that had been damaged during severe storms the previous spring, using chainsaws and heavy equipment to remove debris that had accumulated over several months of neglect. Rodriguez was operating a small bulldozer to push aside a massive fallen oak tree when the machine's blade caught on what initially appeared to be a large piece of buried lumber left over from previous logging operations in the area. Assuming it was simply another piece of storm debris that needed to be cleared from the trail corridor, he attempted to push it aside with the bulldozer, but the object seemed to be anchored firmly in the ground and refused to move despite the machine's considerable power. When Chen came over to investigate the obstruction, they quickly realized that what they had found was not random debris, but a carefully constructed wooden door that had been buried beneath decades of accumulated forest litter, fallen leaves, and natural soil deposition. The door appeared to be much older than typical storm damage and showed construction techniques that seemed inconsistent with modern building practices. The door itself was a remarkable piece of craftsmanship that had somehow survived nearly a century of burial in Michigan's challenging climate. Made from thick oak planks held together with iron hardware that had rusted but remained structurally sound, it measured approximately 4 feet wide by 6 feet tall. The wood showed obvious signs of age and weathering, with several planks split or partially rotted through, but the overall structure remained, clearly recognizable as a door designed for heavy use and serious security purposes. Most intriguingly, the door appeared to have been installed as part of a larger structure, with heavy iron hinges still attached to what looked like a substantial wooden frame that extended deep into the earth. The construction suggested that this was not simply a discarded door that had been dumped in the forest, but rather a functional entrance that had been deliberately concealed and had remained hidden until the recent storm activity had shifted enough soil to expose its upper edges. Chen, who had studied archaeology as an undergraduate before pursuing a career in environmental conservation, immediately recognized the potential historical significance of their discovery. The construction techniques and materials were entirely consistent with early 20th century craftsmanship, and the location corresponded closely with historical accounts she had read about the McKinnon mystery during her studies of local history. The combination of the door's apparent age, its substantial construction, and its location in an area associated with legendary bootlegging activities suggested that this might be the discovery that historians and treasure hunters had been seeking for decades. She convinced Rodriguez to halt their clearing work temporarily while she contacted local authorities and historical preservation officials about what they had found, understanding that disturbing the site further without proper archaeological supervision could destroy valuable evidence or damage historically significant materials. Her background in academic archaeology had taught her the importance of proper documentation and professional oversight when dealing with potentially significant historical discoveries. The initial response from local officials was professional but skeptical, reflecting decades of experience with false alarms from treasure hunters and amateur archaeologists. Sheriff Patricia Williams, whose own family had connections to the original McKinnon investigation through her grandfather's service as a deputy in the 1920s, arrived at the scene within hours of receiving Chen's call. Her department had fielded dozens of reports over the years from individuals who claimed to have found evidence of McKinnon's underground complex, and most of these discoveries had turned out to be nothing more than old root cellars, storm shelters, or other mundane structures with no connection to the legendary Bootlegger. However, Sheriff Williams was experienced enough to recognize that this discovery was qualitatively different from the usual false alarms that crossed her desk. The door's construction and condition suggested genuine historical age, and its location in such a remote area of the forest made it highly unlikely to be connected to any legitimate historical activity that would have left conventional records. More importantly, careful examination revealed that the door was not simply buried in the ground but was actually part of a structure that clearly extended below the surface. When deputies used powerful flashlights to peer through gaps in the rotted planks, they could see that the door opened onto what appeared to be a staircase descending into complete darkness. The staircase appeared to be carved directly into the rock substrate beneath the forest floor, suggesting construction efforts that would have required considerable skill and resources. The professional quality of the stonework visible in the flashlight beams was inconsistent with amateur construction, and indicated that whoever had built this entrance had possessed significant expertise in underground construction techniques. The involvement of state archaeological authorities began with a phone call from Sheriff Williams to Dr. Rebecca Martinez at Michigan State University. Dr. Martinez, one of the state's leading experts on historical archaeology and Prohibition-era sites, had written extensively about the McKinnon legend, and was familiar with both the historical evidence and the various theories about what might have happened to the missing bootlegger. While she remained appropriately cautious about making premature conclusions based on limited evidence, she agreed that the discovery warranted immediate professional investigation and arranged to visit the site the following day with a small team of graduate students and technical specialists. Dr. Martinez's initial assessment confirmed that the site was both historically significant and potentially dangerous to investigate without proper precautions. The wooden door clearly provided access to some kind of underground structure, but the condition of the wooden components and the unknown stability of the underground construction made it unsafe to attempt entry without careful structural evaluation and appropriate safety equipment. More importantly, the construction techniques and materials were entirely consistent with 1920s craftsmanship, and the location matched historical accounts of McKinnon's activities with remarkable precision. She recommended that the site be immediately secured to prevent unauthorized access, and that a comprehensive archaeological investigation be authorized as quickly as possible. The discovery represented exactly the kind of breakthrough that could finally provide definitive answers to questions that had puzzled historians for a century, but only if the investigation was conducted with appropriate professional standards and scientific rigor. The decision to proceed with a full-scale excavation was made jointly by state historical preservation officials and local law enforcement, with emergency funding provided through special allocations from the state archaeology budget. Dr. Martinez was appointed as the lead investigator, and she assembled an interdisciplinary team that included structural engineers capable of evaluating underground construction, historical archaeologists experienced with Prohibition-era sites, and specialists in industrial archaeology who had previous experience with sites related to illegal alcohol production during the 20s and 30s. The investigation officially began on October 30, 2024, exactly 1 week after the initial discovery, and almost exactly 100 years after McKinnon's mysterious disappearance. The timing seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental, as if the forest had been waiting for this precise moment to reveal the secrets it had guarded for an entire century. The first phase of the investigation involved careful excavation around the wooden door to determine the extent and structural condition of the underground entrance system. Using hand tools and careful brushing techniques to avoid damaging fragile materials, the team gradually exposed more of the entrance structure while documenting every detail with digital photography and precise measurements. They discovered that the wooden door was actually the outer layer of a sophisticated double-door security system, with a second metal door located approximately 6 feet below the first level. This inner door was in significantly better condition than the outer wooden structure, having been protected from direct exposure to the elements by the outer barrier. Made from heavy steel plate with reinforced hinges and what appeared to be a complex locking mechanism, it had been designed to withstand both weather damage and potential attacks by law enforcement or rival criminals. The locking system included both conventional key locks and what appeared to be an early combination mechanism, suggesting that access had been strictly controlled even among McKinnon's most trusted associates. Most remarkably, the metal door had been sealed so effectively against the elements that when it was finally opened on November 5, 2024, the air that escaped from behind, it still carried distinctive odors associated with alcohol distillation and wood smoke, nearly a century after the operation had been abandoned. The preservation of these atmospheric traces provided compelling evidence that the underground space had remained essentially sealed and undisturbed since McKinnon's era. When the metal door was finally opened and investigators descended into the underground complex, they found themselves in a carefully constructed corridor that exceeded their most optimistic expectations for both preservation and sophistication. The main tunnel extended in both directions beyond the range of their LED flashlights, with side passages branching off at regular intervals toward different functional areas of the complex. The tunnel itself was approximately 7 feet wide and 6 feet tall, large enough to accommodate the movement of equipment and supplies, but small enough to minimize the structural challenges of underground construction in the local geological conditions. The preservation of the underground complex was remarkable, far better than anyone had dared to hope, given the climate and geological conditions of northern Michigan. The stable underground temperature and relatively dry conditions had protected wooden fixtures, metal equipment, and even some paper documents from the decay that would normally be expected after so many years. In the main storage areas, investigators found dozens of glass bottles still in their original wooden crates, empty but bearing labels from distilleries that had operated during the Prohibition era. The distillation equipment, made from copper and steel, showed clear signs of use but remained in excellent structural condition, testament to both the quality of McKinnon's initial investment and the effectiveness of the preservation conditions in the sealed underground environment. The discovery provided unprecedented physical evidence of a functioning Prohibition-era bootlegging operation, offering researchers their first opportunity to study such facilities with modern archaeological and forensic techniques. As the investigation expanded over the following weeks, the true scope of McKinnon's achievement became apparent to the research team. While not as vast as the most elaborate legends had suggested, the tunnel system was still remarkably sophisticated for its time and circumstances, extending for several hundred yards in multiple directions and connecting more than a dozen separate chambers that had served different functions in the bootlegging operation. The main distillation area included high-quality copper equipment capable of producing substantial quantities of alcohol, while storage chambers had been organized with the precision of a commercial warehouse. The discovery of living quarters deep within the complex provided particularly compelling evidence of the operation's sophistication and the commitment of the men who had worked there. These underground rooms included sleeping accommodations for several people, a communal kitchen equipped with period-appropriate appliances, and recreational areas where workers could spend their limited leisure time. Personal possessions left behind when the site was abandoned included clothing, books, letters, and photographs that provided intimate glimpses into the lives of the men who had chosen to work and live in McKinnon's underground world. Perhaps most significantly from a historical perspective, investigators discovered what appeared to be McKinnon's personal office and planning center, complete with detailed maps of the tunnel system, financial records documenting the scope of his operations, and correspondence with suppliers and distributors throughout the regional area. These documents provided the first concrete evidence of the true scale of his criminal enterprise and revealed business relationships and operational procedures that had never been suspected by the original investigators in the 1920s. The physical evidence found in the underground complex finally provided definitive answers to questions that had puzzled investigators and historians for a century, while simultaneously raising new and equally compelling questions about McKinnon's ultimate fate and the specific circumstances surrounding his disappearance on that February night exactly 100 years earlier. The discovery would not only rewrite the accepted history of Prohibition-era bootlegging in Michigan, but also provide crucial clues about what really happened during those final moments in the dark forest when Red Tom McKinnon vanished forever from the world of the living. The systematic exploration and analysis of McKinnon's underground complex during the winter months of 2024 and 25 revealed layers of complexity and sophistication that challenged every previous assumption about small-scale Prohibition-era bootlegging operations. As Dr. Martinez's interdisciplinary team carefully documented each chamber and corridor, they uncovered evidence of an operation that had functioned with remarkable efficiency and attention to detail, demonstrating that McKinnon had approached his illegal activities with the same professional standards and systematic thinking that might have been applied to any legitimate industrial undertaking. The main production facility demonstrated McKinnon's commitment to quality control and operational efficiency within the constraints of his necessarily secretive operation. The copper still that dominated the central distillation chamber had been manufactured by a legitimate equipment supplier and was virtually identical to those used in legal distilleries before Prohibition. The still was equipped with temperature and pressure monitoring systems that allowed operators to maintain precise control over the distillation process, ensuring consistent quality and maximizing yield from the available raw materials. The ventilation system that supported the distillation operations was a remarkable feat of engineering that had allowed the complex to function undetected for years, despite the telltale smoke and vapors produced by alcohol production. A carefully designed network of air shafts provided adequate circulation while dispersing potentially incriminating emissions through multiple exit points scattered throughout the forest above. The system included primitive but effective filters that reduced odors and prevented the visible emissions that might have attracted attention from aircraft or ground patrols. Storage and inventory management within the complex revealed McKinnon's professional background in industrial engineering and his systematic approach to business operations. Finished products were organized in different chambers according to type, quality level, and intended destination, with a labeling and tracking system that allowed workers to locate specific items quickly while maintaining accurate records of inventory levels and distribution schedules. The storage areas included specialized sections for raw materials, products in various stages of processing, finished goods awaiting shipment, and even returned items that required quality testing or reworking. The discovery of extensive business documentation in McKinnon's personal office provided unprecedented insights into the financial and operational aspects of his criminal enterprise. Detailed financial records showed monthly revenues that often exceeded those of legitimate businesses in the area, with profit margins that reflected both the high quality of his products and the premium prices they commanded in the illegal alcohol market. The records also revealed the substantial costs involved in maintaining such an operation, including payments for raw materials, equipment maintenance, security measures, and compensation for workers and associates. Customer lists and correspondence. Files revealed the sophisticated network of business relationships McKinnon had developed throughout the regional area. His customers included speakeasies and private clubs in multiple states, indicating that his distribution network had extended far beyond the immediate local area. Letters from suppliers showed that he had established relationships with legitimate businesses that provided both raw materials and finished products for resale, often using elaborate cover stories to conceal the true nature of his activities. Communications with other criminal organizations indicated that McKinnon's operation had been part of a much larger and more complex network of illegal activities than had previously been suspected. Coded messages suggested coordination with other bootleggers in different regions, shared transportation resources, and even cooperative security arrangements designed to provide mutual protection against law enforcement and rival criminal groups. The sophistication of these business relationships demonstrated that Prohibition-era bootlegging had evolved into a form of organized crime that operated according to many of the same principles as legitimate business enterprises. The personnel records found in the complex provided detailed information about the men who had worked for McKinnon, including their backgrounds, specific skills, and compensation arrangements. The documents showed that he had employed more than 20 people at various times, ranging from skilled distillers and equipment operators to security personnel and general laborers. Salary records indicated that he had paid his workers significantly more than they could have earned in legitimate employment, ensuring their loyalty while compensating them for the considerable risks involved in criminal activities. Security measures throughout the complex demonstrated McKinnon's acute awareness of the constant dangers inherent in his chosen profession. Multiple escape routes provided alternatives if the main entrance was compromised, with some passages extending several hundred yards from the central facilities toward different areas of the forest. A communication system connected the underground complex with lookout points on the surface, allowing coordination with security personnel without the need for dangerous face-to-face meetings that might have been observed by law enforcement or rival criminals. Weapons storage areas contained firearms and ammunition sufficient to defend the complex against potential attacks, while also providing the means for offensive operations if circumstances required such action. The weapons included both handguns suitable for personal protection and longer-range rifles that could be used for perimeter security or more aggressive defensive measures. The quantity and quality of the weapons indicated that McKinnon had been prepared for serious armed conflict if his operation came under attack. The living quarters within the complex told a poignant story of men who had chosen to live entirely underground rather than risk exposure through regular travel between the hidden facility and their homes in the outside world. These facilities included not only sleeping areas and basic kitchen facilities, but also recreational spaces where workers could spend their limited leisure time. Personal possessions left behind when the site was abandoned included books, musical instruments, games, and photographs that provided glimpses into the humanity of individuals who had been willing to live like underground dwellers in service of McKinnon's enterprise. Among the most significant discoveries was a comprehensive emergency plan that McKinnon had developed for abandoning the complex if circumstances required immediate evacuation. The plan included detailed procedures for destroying sensitive documents, disabling or removing valuable equipment to prevent its use by others, and sealing the various entrances to conceal evidence of the operation from potential discovery by law enforcement. Emergency supply caches distributed throughout the complex could have sustained a small group of workers for several weeks if they had been forced to remain underground while waiting for external dangers to pass. The emergency plan also revealed that McKinnon had prepared multiple escape routes and safe houses for use if his operation was discovered, or if he personally came under direct threat from law enforcement or rival criminals. References to transportation arrangements, hidden financial resources, and contacts in other regions suggested that he had been prepared to flee immediately and establish himself elsewhere if circumstances made continued operation in Michigan impossible. The existence of these detailed preparations raised troubling questions about why he had not implemented them on the night of his disappearance, particularly given the security concerns that had been troubling him during his final weeks of operation. Analysis of evidence from the complex's final days provided crucial insights into the circumstances surrounding McKinnon's disappearance and the rapid abandonment of the facility. The evidence showed that the emergency procedures had been partially implemented, with some sensitive documents destroyed and valuable equipment prepared for removal, but the process had clearly been interrupted before completion. This pattern suggested that whatever happened to McKinnon had occurred suddenly and without sufficient warning to allow his associates to complete their planned evacuation procedures. The partial implementation of evacuation procedures indicated that McKinnon's organization had recognized the immediate danger and had begun taking appropriate protective measures, but had not had sufficient time to respond effectively to whatever threat had materialized. The incomplete nature of the evacuation suggested either that the danger had developed more rapidly than anticipated, or that the threat had specifically targeted McKinnon himself rather than the operation as a whole. The discovery of McKinnon's personal effects in his underground office provided the most emotionally compelling evidence of his final days and the sudden nature of his disappearance. His desk contained unfinished correspondence, including a partially written letter warning an associate about increased law enforcement activity in the area and discussing contingency plans that might need to be implemented. Personal items such as his pocket watch, reading glasses, and a photograph of an unidentified woman remained exactly where he had left them, as if he had simply stepped away temporarily and fully intended to return to complete his work. The forensic analysis of evidence from the complex would ultimately provide new insights into McKinnon's fate and help resolve questions about the circumstances surrounding his disappearance that had puzzled investigators for exactly 1 century. But the discovery of his underground empire had already revolutionized understanding of Prohibition-era bootlegging operations and demonstrated that the truth about Red Tom McKinnon's achievements had been far more remarkable than even his most elaborate legends had suggested. The sophisticated criminal enterprise hidden beneath the Michigan forest represented one of the most extraordinary examples of organized illegal activity in American history, a testament to the ingenuity, ambition, and determination of a man who had challenged federal authority with unprecedented skill and audacity, only to vanish mysteriously at the height of his success and leave behind a mystery that would endure for exactly 100 years.